Welcome to the Lean Blog Podcast. Visit our website at www.leanblog.org. Now, here's your host, Mark Graban.
Hi, this is Mark Graban. Welcome to episode 196 of the podcast for March 18th, 2014. My guest today, he's a returning guest. He's Jim Huntzinger. He's the founder of Lean Frontiers. And we're going to be talking about the training within industry, or TWI methodology, and his new website, whatisTWI.com. So we're going to be talking about topics that build on the first podcast that we did 7 years ago, episode 15, which you can listen to at leanblog.org/15. That might be useful to listen to that one first if you don't know anything about TWI. But here Jim's going to be talking about some of the latest thinking and experiences in this important area, including what a typical TWI journey, if you will, looks like for an organization, why TWI is such a fundamental lean concept and method, and some examples of how TWI is helping in various industries, including healthcare. So I hope you find this interesting. If you want to learn more, go to leanblog.org/196. That's the page for this episode. You can find links to past podcasts, a presentation that I did back in 2010 at a conference about TWI and healthcare, and links to Virginia Mason Medical Center and more. So as always, thanks for listening. Well, Jim, hi. Thanks for being a guest once again here on the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's great to be back with you.
I was looking, and yes, it's been 7 years since we last talked about TWI, training within industry. So it'd be good to get some updates and some of your latest thoughts on what's going on out there. And the one reason we're talking today, maybe we can just get into first, is a new website that you've set up, whatisTWI.com. If you can kind of tell us about the site, what inspired that, and what some of your goals are.
Yeah, the What is TWI website really came about with some conversations we had with the TWI Institute, and just really based on we certainly have made a lot of progress in the last 7 years, as you mentioned, since the last time we talked and since the TWI Summit started. But still, we're still quite surprised how few companies, and even companies that are involved directly with lean implementation and lean development in their own organizations, still weren't aware of TWI or weren't aware on how foundational it is for their efforts in lean. So it's really a campaign to just try to get the word out about TWI, to get a I would say more broad, but a complete broad exposure across the country for industry and business on what TWI can do for them.
Yeah, so you've got kind of a fresh take here on just kind of an introduction to what TWI is, how to learn about it, like you said, how it applies in different industries. So is your goal here to sort of add kind of more information for beginners here, trying to inspire more people to adopt TWI as a mindset and a methodology?
Well, we certainly want to make it, if you go take a look at, what is TWI.com. I mean, it's pretty simple, pretty basic what it goes through, and we really did that because we didn't want to make it tasking for people to read through it real quick to kind of get a base idea of what it is. So our intent with that is to give people this base understanding about what TWI is, where it came from, and basically at a real basic level what it can do for them, and hoping to inspire them to dig into it more, to find out more. There's ways for them to connect on the website to discover more and become more informed. There's a way they can sign up and get more information. So it's really just really how do we get the word out to industry and business so they really know what TWI is and what it, at a basic level what it can do for them. Like I said, hopefully to inspire them to discover more.
Yeah, and I hope everyone will check that out. And people can also go back to episode 17 where you did a good job of covering a lot of the basics. But maybe just as a quick summary for folks who haven't yet heard that earlier episode, what's your short summary if you were introducing training within industry to somebody today?
Yeah, the short summary would be it basically came out of need during World War II at a time when we had the largest demand on industry in the history of the country. And at the same time, all the men went off to war, so we had this gap. And the gap was we had green people coming into industry when we had the need of a huge ramp up. So how do we get these people up to speed as quickly as possible? And that was the gap that TWI came in to fill, and it did a fantastic job of that. First with developing skills for people in industry. It was focused on really the supervisor, employee or hourly employee interface, and the three skills it really tried to cover. It did cover were a skill in instructing. How do we instruct these people? How do we train these people to get them up to speed quickly and safely and conscientiously? And then, of course, a skill in improving, making improvement methods with just what they have there on the shop floor. And then finally, a skill in leading, or how do we deal with potential people problems before they become a large problem? So that's really what the genesis of it was. And then from there, post-World War II, during the occupation of Japan, it was deployed along with many things to help Japan rebuild their industry. And it really came into play in Toyota early on as they were developing and evolving. The Toyota production system became foundational for that work.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point for people who don't realize that something that's so foundational to Lean and the Toyota production system has very, very American roots to solve the problems that you were describing, the problems that were being faced during World War II. When I started my career at GM, and we had some people who were very experienced with the Toyota production system from Toyota suppliers, and when they were coming in and teaching us, or teaching as engineers how to help document job instructions. They never described it as TWI, but even those very early days, there's common themes there of focusing on key points and highlighting safety and quality very clearly within the document. And I think the most important lesson of explaining why key points are important. I think it's just really interesting to see how these ideas have kind of bounced back and forth across the ocean, and sometimes the American roots of at least that aspect of Lean get kind of lost sometimes, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I have a colleague, and this is a number of years ago. He was talking with somebody that works at Toyota, and was telling him about TWI, and the guy had no idea what he's talking about. But then when he went in to describe the details of the different J programs, job instructions, job methods, and job relations, the guy kept going, "Oh yeah."
I know that. Yeah.
Do that. So he knew it in the essence of what the skills were, but not the overarching story, because they used that, and they still use it to this day. Although it's certainly evolved since they've been using it now for 5 or 6 decades, as they've matured and developed the organization overall. Although at a basic level, some of the elements they still use is exactly the same as when they came into Toyota, 5 or 6 decades ago.
Right. And I'd like to come back later in our chat and talk about healthcare and what people are doing today and what's being published and what's being worked on. But even going back to World War II, I think it's really interesting to discover the nursing journal articles from 1945 and 1947 talking about the application even then of the TWI methodology in training and developing nurses and other healthcare professionals more quickly and more competently, sort of like TWI was accomplishing in the factories.
Yeah, and certainly you're right. Back then they realized and showed by those articles in particular that can be used in a variety of different industries. And that was something else, was one of their objectives was as the war effort went on, they were going to have this successful in a variety of industries and businesses. So they had to come up with something that essentially, as Doc Hall will say a lot of times, something that was bulletproof, that will work as effectively in any industry or business that it's introduced. So that was certainly one of their objectives early on, and that objective still carries through today, as we discuss a little bit later, how there are different industries that are using it successfully. Yeah,
so let's talk about what's going on today, and maybe what has changed or how things are progressing since 2007. If people ask what does TWI have to do with organizations that are developing Lean as a business model, maybe not just using Lean as tools, but really embracing Lean as part of their strategy. How does TWI fit into what you see companies doing or what they should be doing?
I think at a couple different main points. One is it's as we discussed earlier, it's such a foundational skill set, like a skill set in teaching people how to do jobs and instructing, in making improvements just with what you have available, the people in your area, and resources available, and then again a skill in leading, or how do you deal with people problems, hopefully before they become problems, or even after they do become larger problems, how do you deal with them then? So it's such a basic skill set, and that's why it becomes so important. So in taking that and looking at the other main point is, obviously we've learned, particularly over the last maybe 4 to 7 years, how important culture is. And organizations want to say, how do we develop a lean culture, a learning culture, a no blame culture, all those different titles we give to it. Well, it's TWI is foundational in creating that type of culture, although that wasn't their overt objective when they developed this. It accomplished that. So if we want this learning culture, this problem-solving culture, this becomes a critical element, particularly, obviously the problem-solving. And that's what you talk with people from Toyota, and they've talked about this for a number of years now, is what they're really trying to do is we're trying to develop a culture or an organization where at every level our people can solve problems. And for that, solve problems in order to implement flow of material, flow of parts, flow of information. So how do we create an environment where everybody at every level is helping solve problems so we can create flow, to bring value to the customer? So that at a basic level is what TWI brings, the skills to do that, to get that skill to your people.
And it's interesting to me that you talk about a learning culture, and there's a lot of high-minded talk at business schools and people who've read Peter Senge and other books that have been popular in the last 20 years to talk about learning organizations and a learning culture, and there's high-minded goals, and people say we would love to have that in our organization, but then when you look at the things you're describing in TWI of how to create that, I imagine people's eyes quickly glaze over. I'm like, what talking about training? Like, training and frontline supervisors and that stuff that might seem, boring, or it might seem like, just basic blocking and tackling to executives. And I think, the challenge or the ironic thing is that the things that senior leaders often don't pay a lot of attention to are the very things that would get the organization to something they maybe do care about, that high-minded ideal of being a learning organization. So, have you found over the last 7 years or through some of your work ways of closing that gap and getting leaders to pay attention to some of these things that are so foundational to how well a company operates?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and with multiple levels. Like you said, they look at it, and it truly is. It's just basic blocking and tackling, and it is. But the key to that is if you don't have the basic blocking and tackling down, then these higher level skills or techniques or other things you want to accomplish are going to be at best difficult, and in fact often impossible to accomplish because you don't have the basics down. And that's why this is so critical, even though it seems very basic, is you must have the basics in place and be and have the ability to execute them very well if you want to be successful at the higher level things. And that's back to what companies have done to be successful with this. Well, essentially that's what they've kind of discovered. A number of companies that are successful with TWI and their overall lean work, that's what they discovered early on. They first came in and just, okay, let's do some TWI training and life should be wonderful. Well, it's not quite that simple. You certainly have to be very deliberate about it. So you want to develop this basic skill set and a certain level of maturity with it. So you want to become very skilled at that basic skill. And then once you get to that point, it does two things. Once you kind of have it, you make it almost second nature. And ideally, you want it second nature where people just naturally behave in that manner. So that's one level of success. But once people get experience with that, and that may be what I call maturity, mature with that, or experience with it, all of a sudden then, it, in a sense, lights their eyes up to all these other things they can utilize it for. An interesting example of that is with Mike Rother in his book Toyota Kata. That certainly became popular in the last number of years. Well, if you look at a lot of the guys, Mike itself and a lot of the guys he's working with that are going out and doing the kata, teaching the improvement kata and the coaching kata, they have integrated the TWI methodology into that because it is so foundational from a problem-solving standpoint. And from that standpoint, you can relate it to the scientific method, or in Lean, we typically will say the plan, do, check, act cycle, the Schuhart and Deming cycle. Well, TWI, I like to call, is a functional application of that scientific method. So when these organizations discover that and get that integrated into their people, then all of a sudden they start moving forward in a lot of other areas, these higher level areas, at a much more effective and rapid rate.
Yeah, and let's transition to talking about what you see organizations doing to effectively incorporate TWI into their culture and their way of operating, because I think, like you're saying, this isn't just something that you can buy and install or implement. A lot of people don't like that word implement. But I mean, is there a path that helps people kind of really consistently make this part of their culture? What do you see working well out there?
Yeah, I'd say the key elements are this. But, just taking back what we were talking about is getting that basic skill in place at some level of experience and maturity. But you need to do, and this is something, and they've even learned this during the war, and of course over the last 7-8 years, companies that are learning this as well, and the ones that are successful are learning it, is you need to, like I said, do it deliberately. And what that means in one form is you need to have a need. What problem are we trying to solve with TWI? So it's like a lot of other tools. You just let's go do the tool and life will be wonderful. No, let's make it deliberate. Let's figure out what need, what objective, what problem we are trying to solve. So at an initial level, trying to figure that out. So let's give ourselves a reason why we're doing this. Not only is it for an organization, but for the individuals doing it. They need a reason why they're using this, and what advantage and what goals they're trying to meet with it. So it's almost like a second level. Then the third level, and there's a lot of details underneath that, but the third level is this should be part of your strategy. Again, relating to what problem are we trying to solve, but it should go under your organizational objectives and strategies specifically as you get this higher level of experience and maturity. And again, that's where companies that have made it to that point really what they end up getting is they go, my gosh, we see so many places we can utilize this. We need to take a step back, again, reflect and say, okay, we need to prioritize what we want to go after, because we see multiple applications that this will help us with. So what are our priorities of our problems we're trying to solve, which essentially is your strategy, be used with your strategy deployment, your Hoshin Conry activities as well.
Yeah, and I think that's always a great question to ask. What problem are we trying to solve? John Shook very recently put a video out on the LEI website talking about the transformation model that they're developing, and like I said, it's a very familiar mantra of, okay, well, what problem are we solving? So, for example, what I see in hospitals from a more tactical standpoint, and then maybe you can help me bring it back to the strategic level. What I see happening, for example, tactical setting, what's the problem? Nurse managers, leaders will say, our nurses and our staff are not consistently following certain protocols and bundles that are designed to help protect patients from, let's say, from falling. So, sometimes there's a bit of it's often a blaming reaction, blaming the nurses for not following the bundles. And then when you go and really observe the work and talk to people about the work and have the clinical nurse educators who know about the work, and find out, at least half of the time, the nurses don't know what the bundle really is. They think they're doing the work the right way, but they're not. And so I think, to me, it always falls back on the TWI expression of, well, if the student hasn't learned, the teacher hasn't taught. And so, well, we can't blame nurses for not being trained well. That's an organizational function and a leadership responsibility. And, you can go and create job instructions and use the TWI training methodologies to ensure that, we're not just blasting a memo at people, but we're actually training and letting people practice and getting confirmation of their skills. Those are instances where I've seen, the basics of TWI be very, very effective. But I wonder, if there are organizations out there, say, other than Virginia Mason Medical Center, that's published a book about their use of TWI. Is there anyone, I wonder, who's using it strategically to say, if our hospital can be the best at training and executing just the basic blocking and tackling of being a hospital that will therefore be a leader in our market and therefore be most successful. That would that be an example of using TWI more strategically and with that intent, or how would you describe it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't remember which healthcare system. It could be Virginia Mason. It might be Seattle Children's Hospital. But one of them, there's a story they had when they introduced TWI. Again, I think this illustrates the power of getting the basics down and even looking at it basically, but with deliberate intent, and how powerful it can be. So they're as they trained in it, their first objective was, well, let's take something pretty simple. Gets back to, well, is this really that important, because this is something so basic and simple? But they focused on washing hands. So they used job instruction to go through the analysis and develop a methodology to wash hands, and then deployed it through TWI, trained everybody on it. So a very basic skill, seemingly something that's not that important as far as a procedure, but the impact they had from it was, and I don't remember the exact number, but they reduced the infection rate by 80-some%. Mm-hmm. So from a quality of care and from a cost standpoint, that seemingly simple task of washing their hands had a huge organizational impact. So that really was, an eye-opening for them on, wow, this can really be something very powerful that we can use.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is probably true in other industries as well. In healthcare, there's a real temptation for people to just want to buy new fancy technology, and they say, well, we're going to solve the problem by buying tracking systems or RFID tags, or put cameras in the ceiling and have all this technology to monitor. We'll see and measure if people are washing hands and performing hand hygiene, when it seems like a lot of times there's a simpler solution just in the basic blocking and tackling of TWI and lean. How do you do your work? How do you make sure people are trained effectively to do their work? And then I think some of the other aspects of lean, including how do we make sure people have time to do the work the right way? Answering those questions doesn't require huge investments in technology.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, the biggest investment is really time, and I think that not just, TWI plays a direct role in that, but overall. So if we take the time to train people in these skills, let them improve the processes by utilizing these skills, and as they get maturity and experience with it, you get to the point where you make, just like that hand washing example. That was no technology at all. But yet in doing that, when you do get to the point, if you do have to make some type of investment, then now the need or the amount of investment is generally greatly diminished, and it's much more specified. So you spend less on it, and since you have such a better grasp of the situation and what your needs are and requirements, when you do outlay some type of capital, you're going to be much more effective at doing it as well. So there's multiple benefits you get out of that, and the TWI and having that skill becomes a springboard to be able to accomplish that. Again, that's us saying, notwithstanding other techniques and skills that you need depending what your industry is, but again, that's why this becomes so foundational to all of that.
Yeah, and I could see in situations where there is new technology being incorporated, using TWI to make sure people know how to use said technology. I see a lot of blaming. For example, I'll bring it back to hospitals where leaders will blame doctors for not using the computerized order entry systems, and then when you talk to the doctors and people involved, they'll either say, well, we didn't really get trained very well, it's hard to use, I don't know how to use it the right way. And it just seems so often to fall back on issues of putting that time investment into properly training and confirming that people don't, beyond just knowing how to log in, that they know how to use the system the best way. What are the key points about using the system this way means it'll take half the time compared to stumbling through whichever way you figured out. It seems like there's huge opportunities to improve the way we use technology through TWI.
Yeah, exactly. And even some more examples of that. I know there's several organizations that obviously we work with that have been to the summit and presented, where they have taken into service. So Starbucks has been using TWI, so that's kind of interesting because that's a service orientated business industry where well, how technical can you be on, people serving coffee and other things? Well, the answer is you can be much more effective at getting those people up to speed, having better customer service. So they've had success with that. Another one a number of years ago was Lazy Boy, who was utilizing TWI in the training of the Lazy Boy retail stores around the country, training their salespeople. Again, well, selling, that's an art form.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, certainly there's some art form to it, but as far as getting people up to speed where they can go and start making sales out on the floor, and again, it's been a number of years ago, I don't remember the exact number, but they drastically reduced the time from somebody coming into that position until they were successful on the floor by utilizing job instruction and some of the other things around TWI. And other ones are, there's some organizations in electronics that have used TWI, and they've, again, got themselves mature enough with the skill set of it. They're actually utilizing the basics of breakdown and development and analysis that TWI gives you in a lot of their engineering work. So that's one of the things before they would have never comprehended this, but once they got some maturity with it, they envisioned that, boy, we can do all kinds of stuff with this in our product development and engineering.
Yeah, and it seems like there's great opportunities in areas where there's growth. So you mentioned about sales and ramping up quickly, and I think people would probably associate TWI with boring, old, big, slow growth manufacturing companies.
Yes.
When we look back to what was the original problem being solved? How do we ramp up people very quickly into factories? So I would be curious, and it's probably something I should try to collaborate or share these ideas with people in the quote unquote lean startup community.
Yes.
Say, well, once you've proven your business model and what they call product market fit, and now that you're ready to scale, that's a problem startups have. How do we ramp up quickly? How do we ramp up effectively? It seems like this approach that would have big opportunities to software companies that are adding more developers, adding more salespeople. How do you make that a repeatable process with less of a failure rate? It seems like that would be an interesting way to apply this.
Yeah, well, it would be. And you bring up an interesting point, Mark, because if you look at, since TWI's kind of came back in, we still have a ton more work to do with it. Obviously, one of the reasons for, what is TWI campaign, but it's probably been, we're looking at, 7 to 9 years that we kind of reintroduced it. Well, if you look at the war, in just 5 years, they went from having no program whatsoever to having a very broad and huge impact on our war effort from a manufacturing standpoint in only 5 years.
Yeah.
So look how much territory they covered in such a short time.
So maybe to kind of wrap up a little bit, when we talk about what's been happening in the last 7 years with TWI, what's your sense? I mean, I'm sure I'm about to throw a question at you that I find really hard to answer. People ask me, well, what percentage of hospitals are using lean? And part of me says, well, I don't know. I don't know how we would know that. And I don't know if it's really that important, because I think we use lean because it's effective, not because it's popular.
Yes.
So I'll unfairly throw that similar question to you. What percentage of organizations are using TWI, or just more broadly? I mean, have you found greater acceptance or use of it in the last 7 years?
Yeah, it's certainly grown, and just even with the attendees, the community, we like to call it, that comes to the TWI summit, we certainly see a difference in the maturity level of a lot of them. Obviously, the first year of it, people were showing up just going, well, what is TWI? Some of them may at best say, well, I've heard of it, but I don't know much about it. I want to learn about it. To where, and that we saw people coming in like that down the road here, even today, but you're getting more organizations that are coming in, go, obviously, I know exactly what TWI is, and we're using it, but we are wanting to learn from others, other companies, other peers, some of the thought leaders, on how we can leverage this further and faster. We believe we see some of that, but we feel if we talk and network and meet with other people, we can see more. So how do we integrate this into our organization? Because that's one thing, is they don't want to just use TWI for the sake of using TWI.
Right.
How do we make this part of our underlying culture so we get a higher level of effectiveness with it and a more rapid level of effectiveness with us? And that's what we're really trying to see. People are trying to figure out I always hate to say the answers, because there's no answers, trying to figure out what paths they need to take in order to develop that skill and ability internally in their organizations. And that's what we're trying to achieve with that. For the new people coming in, the basics up through the people that are mature with it, knowing that they could use this at a higher level. So what do they need to do in order to accomplish that?
So what problems are we trying to solve, and what are we trying to do strategically as an organization, right?
Yeah. And one thing I might say as we wrap up here, and I like to use this because I think it's relevant. Again, for those who may have looked at the Mike Rother's Toyota Kata book, he has a diagram he uses in there where you start off with a current condition and you have a target condition. And then you traverse, as he calls it, through the unclear territory. And it's really a series of steps, learning as you go along, and essentially using the plan, do, check, act cycle. And that's what I think the key with this, having that foundation skill set with TWI to be able to traverse that unclear territory. And what I like to say is, we don't want just people comfortable in that unclear territory. We want people thriving in that unclear territory. And to me, TWI becomes the foundation in order to get people the skill, so they want to be in that unclear territory. They get some organizations, you find people get a little bit upset when they can't be in that area. Right. And that's the culture that we want to develop. That's that culture of learning, that culture of problem solving.
Well, great. Well, Jim, maybe just one other thing we can share with folks, if people are interested in the TWI Summit, we've mentioned, what is TWI.com? What are some other websites or places people can look to find out more about your events and what you're working on?
Well, certainly they can go to our homepage, our home website, which is leanfrontiers.com. And if you go there, you can learn about our organization, and also it has links to all the summits that we do, obviously including the TWI Summit. Also, too, the Lean HR Summit, and interestingly enough, this year they will both be in May 8th and 9th in Nashville, Tennessee. But we're actually bringing those two communities together because both of them have the overarching objective of developing an organization through developing people. So this will be a unique year for both of those and growing both communities and joining them together.
Well, that's great to hear, and certainly encourage folks to go out and take a look at the website. I'll have a link to all these websites in the show notes if you go to the blog and find the page for this episode. Again, our guest has been Jim Huntzinger. Thank you so much for talking again, and hopefully it's not 7 years before we do this again.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mark. I enjoy this very much and look forward to doing it again soon.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening. This has been the Lean Blog Podcast. For Lean news and commentary updated daily, visit www.leanblog.org. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast, email Mark at leanpodcast@gmail.com.